mighty. Not because you want to, but you have to. Be bold and no time to be bashful. Grab life by the horns like a natural. Be sharp, be quick, and be agile. Never ever let a competitor catch you. Stay ahead of whatever is trying to pass you. Though it's not a race.
Hello and welcome. My name is Samuel Ray, also known to some as Dr. Sam, and this is the Morning Boot Up, my weekly solo segment where I just talk for a bit about a subject that's on my mind. No scripts, no real planning what I'm going to say beforehand, just my unfiltered thoughts. So this week I wanted to talk on the topic of like game design or in the industry, like just my thoughts on like mainstream and niche kind of titles. So we'll just say mainstream versus niche. And the reason I've been thinking about this is because, you know, I've grown up playing through playing games since 1994-ish, 1995. And back then, what I played on was the Sega Genesis with my father. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 being the first game I ever played. And my introduction to the world of gaming as a whole. My father is actually the one who introduced me to the games. So we played many more games besides just that. That was just the first one I ever played, so it was formative. And at the time, you know, Sonic was Sega's rivalry answer to Mario. The Super Mario Brothers games, and Super Mario World games, particularly, which were the ones that were out at the time, on Super Nintendo. Sonic was sort of the embodiment of 90s counterculture, while Mario was the gaming mainstay and what was popular and kind of helped Nintendo bring gaming back after the great video game crash of the late 80s or mid 80s I should say, due to just a deluge of poor quality games on the Atari era. Mario and Nintendo helped to bring games back and make it more popular than ever. And we know through time, originally gaming was more of a niche hobby and activity in and of itself. But like I said, my father introduced me to games. At the time, he was in his early mid 20s, and, you know, it wasn't that big a deal. And then Sonic was supposed to be the cool, edgy one with attitude, to compare to Mario's kind of bland personality. Very Mickey Mouse, always smiling, same basic facial expressions and so on. Not really much of a deep personality or backstory to speak of. Sonic was the one who was supposed to draw people in via his personality, which could be seen not only in the facial expressions, but also just his design as it was, where it took inspirations from and such. So, then and there, you know, my first game ever, and thus first game series, was rooted in that niche counterculture, but it became popular enough to compete with Mario as rivals on equal footing. Actually, for a bit, I think the better part of a year, if not a whole year, Sega had the majority of the market share, 65% or something like that. So, for a bit, Sonic was more popular than Mario was. And just pretty much instantly broke into the mainstream, as far as the gaming industry is concerned, and became a household name even among non-gamers, with the cartoons, the comic books, and so on. Chef Boyardee partnership, those janky popsicles that would always melt in in the weirdest ways, to really just deform Sonic's face. He really hit the mainstream pretty quick. McDonald's, or was it McDonald's toys? Or Burger King toys, I'm not sure which one it was, but either way. Mainstream stuff, But it never really, not early on anyway, didn't lose sight of what made it enjoyable. What made it popular. It never forgot its roots, it just refined the roots, at least for a while. And as Cy Prime and I spoke of in our proper, main feature podcast episode for March, the Sonic series began experimenting with the formula a lot more than the Mario series did. Trying new things, not just sticking with one formula through its whole life, or two formulas, or, the same basic formula, but in different forms, as the Mario series did. So, the Sonic series, started to carve out niches within its own fan base. Those who like the classic 2D style games, those who liked spin-offs, those who liked the 3D style games, and then that branched off into two different styles of 3D games, from the adventure games to the boost games, and it's a crazy, very interesting story with a lot of twists and turns. But as gaming grew, more genres were born. Genres rose and fell. Some hit it big, others faded into obscurity. And I've played a variety of genres growing up. So many different types of games, from platformers, which is what got me into games, to racing games, to sports games. I used to play a ton of football games with my dad. From the early sports talk football game on Sega Genesis, which was one of the first to have audio vocal commentary, like commentary tracks recorded for it. The sound was crunchy as heck because it was heavily compressed to fit onto the cartridges, but it was revolutionary for the time. And then the Madden series from the late 90s through the early 2000s. Racing games like Need for Speed. My father and I used to play Need for Speed 1 Special Edition and Need for Speed 2 on our PC. Way back during the Windows 95 days. Or was it Windows 97? One of those two. It was probably Windows 97. But regardless, it was really early on. And just, a wide variety of games. RPGs, and so on. So I've experienced most genres at least once. Heck, I've even played a little bit of real-time strategy in the form of Star Wars Empires? Or Star Wars Empire at War or something like that on a friend's PC back in the day in my young teen years. So, yeah, I've played a lot of different genres growing up. Aerial dogfighting games like the Star Wars Rogue Squadron games, some of my favorites growing up, actually. Star Wars Jedi Knight games, Jedi Knights 2 and 3 particularly. Just a wide variety. Fighting games too, from 2002 to mostly 2002 to 2020, or 2022, something like that. Roughly 20 years. And, some of those genres are very much mainstream, like shooters and sports games, and others are more niche, like real-time strategy and fighting games. And I've seen how the developers in those genres, they follow certain trends that appeal to a specific target audience. And, I understand that there's a balance to be found, right? Something to be said about knowing your target audience and designing to appeal to them. Because if you design something to appeal to everyone, then most of the time you'll appeal to no one. Or at least that's how the phrase goes. If you try to appeal to everyone, or if you try to please everyone, you'll please no one. You have to know what your vision is, what your target audience is, and stick to your guns to an extent. But you do also need to take into account feedback and figure out how to identify which feedback you want to listen to and which ones you need to discard and disregard completely. Because if you listen to everyone, then you will have a mess of a game that just has no vision, no clear direction. And that never turns out well. So you need some consistency of vision and a target audience you're aiming for in order to give you that vision, that direction. And it's not always just one person who has that vision or direction. It can be a team, but they need to have consistency among themselves as well, not fighting to do different things with the same property or the same game in and of itself. So, but we've seen the rise of a lot more mainstream games that feel similar, or that share so many similarities that they can start to feel a little samey. Particularly in genres like sports games, racing games, and shooters. And the sub-communities within. So if we take into account, for example, the shooter genre, with Call of Duty rising to be the most popular and most mainstream of them, many other games in the same genre started to follow suit and kind of imitate what Call of Duty did, including the likes of Halo 4, which, while I didn't hate it back in the day, it is widely seen as one of the least popular of the franchise. Definitely less popular than Halo 3, which I was never really into. I more preferred Halo Reach, which kind of went back to basics compared to Halo 3 and 2. And that was my first one I played, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I liked the futuristic sci-fi story of it. It was actually pretty realistic and down to earth, the way they portrayed the characters and the setting. Just very sci-fi, and sci-fi is awesome. I love sci-fi. But Halo 4 did introduce some Call of Duty elements, especially into the online multiplayer. And then so many other games started to have a very similar feel. And then the ones that didn't follow that design tendencies, those design trends, sort of fell to the wayside. Like, if you look at, what was it? There was a series, I never played it myself, but there was a game that was similar to Call of Duty that came out around the same time, but was a bit more realistic and tactical. Medal of Honor, I think, was what it was called. That one faded into obscurity and just disappeared outright. I think they tried to revive it, but it just did not hit. And so it went back into obscurity and went dormant again. And then you do have some that try to do things differently, like Battlefield or whatever, your Counter-Strike type games, which haven't changed in forever. And those more tactical ones like that in Rainbow Six or whatever. And then you have your variation of shooters, the Battle Royale. Fortnite being the preeminent example of it, at least the one that made it go mainstream, because of its more broad appeal in its graphical design. It's got the cartoony design inspired by Pixar animation that then would inspire many other games that came out after it to have a very similar look to it, like Overwatch and that now defunct or closed down Rumbleverse. And if you're not into that art style, it can be kind of off-putting. But the format of the Battle Royale shooter took root. And, it was popular. It still is popular, I should say. But it hit, and just hit real, it hit it big. And just blew up in popularity, becoming one of the biggest games of all time. And it's still going strong, even though its popularity has waned a little bit. It's still going extremely strong. And has so many different, IP crossovers and stuff, and events. It's crazy popular still. Same with like League of Legends, you know? Same kind of thing, where it's waned in popularity a bit, but it's still one of the biggest games out there. But if you... So the way I think about it though is there are people out there who look at anything mainstream and just say, if it's mainstream, it's gotta be bad. I think that that's not always true. I think if something's popular, it's popular for a reason, right? That reason is a valid reason, because it worked. Now, whether or not an individual sees it as something that appeals to them or not, that's complete subjective matter of taste. And each person has their own taste. What appeals to them, what they enjoy playing, and what they don't. That's how it should be. You know, regarding fighting games, my tastes are very much against the grain and against what the majority likes. And so I haven't had a fighting game to really hook me for about 5 years. That's just how it goes. But that's kind of also part of what inspired me to even think about this topic. Because if the majority do like it, like a large group of people like it, there's got to be some reason, right? And some people say, you know, it appeals to the greatest common denominator or the least common denominator, but we do have to keep in mind that the casual market is and will always be the majority market. And so if something appeals to them, while still providing something to dig into for the more hardcore niche market, then that's a pretty good balance to strike. Just because it doesn't focus on the hardcore niche audience, first and foremost, doesn't make it a bad product per se. And I think games like Fortnite and, you know, the other biggest Battle Royale shooter, Apex Legends, I don't think either of those are necessarily bad games just because they appeal to a broad audience, because they still have a clear direction in how the game feel is, how the gameplay is, you know, the rules and such. Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do with it because they have like essentially like a Halo Forge mode built into them. I think it's called creative mode or something like that, where people can create their own maps and game modes and stuff like that. But the primary game mode in Fortnite is Battle Royale shooter. And if you've ever played one, you have an idea of how it plays. It's consistent in its direction. You know, only with small modifiers like the building or the zero build mode, which personally I prefer zero build. I'm just not a fan of the building. And then Apex Legends is even more consistent in its gameplay, right? It only recently added a like team deathmatch mode where it's not a battle royale. They added a traditional shooter side mode basically. But you know what you're getting into when you jump into one of those. And you know, there's a level of polish there that it deserves the, you know, credit that it deserves. It's appealed to a large amount of people because it doesn't feel super janky. It doesn't feel unpolished, right? Neither of these games. So that does make them decent games. Now, whether you like the battle pass system or whatever, I mean, let's be honest. I'm not the kind to take part in battle passes. I just don't buy them because I don't like the feel of having to play a certain amount of time per month or per season or whatever amount of time before a deadline in order to get my money's worth. You know, spend a battle pass or purchase a battle pass up front, and then however many rewards you get from it depends on how much you play. I don't like that system. It's not for me because I'm not the kind of person who can play one game like that and just that one game so much and grind out the battle pass rewards. I can't do that. I want to play at my own pace and my own frequency and mix it up with variety with other games. So I just don't buy battle passes. And you know what? Not buying a battle pass doesn't put me at any kind of a mechanical disadvantage in the game itself. It just means that I'm not going to get certain cosmetics, and that I'm okay with that. Not having certain cosmetics isn't going to make me enjoy the game less. So I'm okay with it. You know, it's a way to make money from the people who want to spend money on it and get those rewards, those cosmetic rewards. but it's completely optional and doesn't impact your gameplay experience in the slightest. So I'm cool, you know? Me who chooses not to use battle passes at all am not at a disadvantage in like stats or anything like that compared to the people who do buy the battle passes. So it's fair. You know, it's fair and it's not predatory. Sure, it kind of plays into fear of missing out, or FOMO as people call it, to shorten. But I think that speaks less about the predatory, like having a predatory nature, and it speaks more to how poorly people have impulse control. You know, how little impulse control people have, I should say. And that's more of a cultural and societal issue, really, because people are not raising their kids to have good impulse control, plus the instant gratification nature of so many on-demand services really has decreased people's ability to control impulse purchases. You know, for me, I was raised to be very frugal with my money and to consider the cost before buying anything of a substantial cost. Consider the cost, consider if it's worth it, and budget around it so I can, you know, if I buy this one thing I want, then I'm not going to buy this other thing I want until I can safely save up for it and get it without negatively impacting necessary expenses. So budgeting and impulse control are things that I was raised with in my upbringing, and parents teaching me how to manage my money from a very young age, actually. So I have good impulse control. It doesn't matter if, you know, something seems like it's going to be, oh, this is available for a limited time only. If it's not something I really, really want, to the extent that I'm okay foregoing something else not essential in order to buy it, if it's not something that I want to that extent, and it's not something I need, I'm okay missing out on it. That's fine. It doesn't hurt me at all. So the fear of missing out is not a thing for me. You know, it's just not a factor. So battle passes are not predatory for me. And I think if more people in this day and age had that kind of impulse control, then no one would really be able to realistically consider battle passes predatory. So that the fact that people consider it predatory speaks more about the people than the practice. But that tangent aside, or that aside over with, I don't think that those types of games, even though they're mainstream, I don't think them being mainstream makes them bad. They are good games in their own right. Whether they're for you as an individual, that's up to your subjective taste. But objectively speaking, they're not bad games by any means. They're not terrible, they're not poorly made, poorly developed, poorly programmed, none of that. So I don't think that that's an example of mainstream equaling bad. That's honestly, it's just a hipster mentality of, if it's widely popular, then it can't be good. I don't think that's always true, and there's no real tangible, objective, proof that that's a consistent eventuality. If something is widely popular, there's a reason for it. And video game developers and publishers are companies, they're businesses. They have to make money, right? It's not a charity. So they make the games and they have to make some money off of it, so they do what they can to make them profitable. And if something works, well, that's on the people who made it work, right? The audience, the consumer, the players. They're the ones who make certain things profitable and certain other things not profitable. It's not really the company's fault for taking advantage of what the consumer makes profitable. And then, obviously, some companies go way too far, to the extent of where it's essentially just gambling, and that's a completely different can of worms that has its own ethical discussion around it. That's definitely not the same thing. So, and that's a topic for a whole nother day, honestly. That's its own deep dive to talk into, or to talk about. and a completely different, you know, line of thought that needs to be given to it. So I'm not going to go into depth about that here. But again, as long as it doesn't affect the gameplay itself, and it's just cosmetic, then that whole FOMO thing, that's on the people who have, you know, who lack their impulse control. And that's pretty much what I stand by. You know, it's just, you need impulse control in this world of conveniences that cost money. You have to be able to budget, what do I want to buy now and what can I go without. Simple as that. Now, on the other side of the coin, I want to talk about niche. Are there cases where something being niche inherently makes it a better product? Yes and no, I think. It really depends, because there are some games that did not cater to the mainstream trends in gameplay or design or monetization that absolutely did benefit from it. You know, let's look at a game that, you know, tried to be a mainstream AAA title, right? Like Forspoken, but it followed the wrong kind of mainstream trends. And I'm not going to go into this, but it definitely was influenced by certain people in the AAA spheres, socio-political beliefs and leanings that pretty often have a negative impact on the end product. You know, the final product, I should say. It had elements of that. I'm not saying it's like a completely, you know, tainted kind of product or anything of that sort, but there were elements of it that just made it kind of off-putting to a large amount of people. You know, it honestly, Forspoken was seen to be more of a case where they tried to make it a bit too much like a movie. Tried to make the characters talk like they're in an MCU movie and stuff like that, and it just doesn't work for video games more often than not, you know? Like having the constant banter between the main character and the cuffs, the talking cuffs or whatever, and just the type of banter. I mean, banter can be great. You know, it can be great for setting, you know, building the setting, the relationship between the characters and so on, and giving them some personality. So banter can be great. You know, the Uncharted series has some great banter in it, and such. You know, the Tales of series has great banter in the little skits between the different characters that have no real bearing on the overall story, but are just great for character building and giving them personality. So it was the execution. And then you had a game that released around the same time that was just shadow dropped, Hi-Fi Rush, which so many people loved because they had a vision and they stuck to it. Rhythm, character, action game, kind of like your Cadence of Hyrule and such type games, but it was an action game, kind of like your Platinum games type of games. And I mean, great art style and graphical style, great characters apparently, really well written, you know, funny and comedic, doesn't take itself too seriously. That way it can lean into the funny writing, you know, the comedic writing style. But the action gameplay I've heard is top notch, and the rhythm, you know, the marriage of action gameplay and rhythm gameplay, how everything in the world moves to the beat of the music, and I've just heard great things about it. And it was something that definitely didn't try to be mainstream. It tried to do its own thing, and it benefited for that. You know, it was well loved, well received. Here's another case. Elden Ring. From Software. They're the kings of doing their own thing. They've never been the kind who try to go mainstream with their games, even ever since they were making the old Kingsfield and Armored Core games. Those were never mainstream. Those were their own thing. You know, very niche, honestly. And very loved by that niche. Elden Ring broke into the mainstream by doing something different, because here's the thing. Before Elden Ring, a lot of their games were almost too niche. Like the Dark Souls series did start to grow in its mainstream acceptance and like the audience, the broadness of the audience that started playing it and enjoying it, but there was always those certain elements that were holding it back. And it was when they found something that they could add to the formula. Player choice. Instead of having to beat your head into the wall, that was a very tough boss that you are struggling with until you overcome it, or you give up, one of the two. Either way, you're not progressing until you beat this boss. Was generally the case in FromSoft games. They made it so that they gave players the freedom of choice. Oh, are you struggling with this part? You can go somewhere else in this vast open world and come back later when you're more powerful or you have different equipment that might change up your playstyle a bit and allow you to more easily tackle that particular challenge. They didn't make it easy. They didn't make the game easier. It's still tough as nails. They just gave more choice. And that kind of came from the Armored Core series that they did before they ever made the first Dark Souls game. In Armored Core, you would get a set of missions that you could choose from, and you didn't have to play every mission on a single run. Actually, if anything, it was impossible to, because as you completed missions, or even failed some that you couldn't retry, certain missions would then become unavailable for the rest of that run through the campaign, and new ones would become available. And if you just continue on through, then all missions will become available after you complete the campaign, the final mission. It was not linear by any means, the Armored Core series games, in terms of which missions you completed in your runs. And heck, you didn't even have to complete certain missions. Certain missions you could fail, just eat the cost of the repair costs or whatever, repair and resupply, and then just move on and just say, you know what, I don't see myself ever being able to beat this mission with my current equipment, and instead of starting the game over from the beginning, I'm just gonna take the loss and move on. I did that in my playthrough of the Armored Core 3 series games on my own time. There were missions where I just could not complete them. I would reload the save and retry, change my loadout for my mech, and no matter what I did, I just couldn't beat certain missions. And so I said, screw it, I'll just move on, I'll eat the cost, I'll take the loss, and just cut my losses and move on. And that was fine. I was able to complete the games because I made that choice. And then there were other times where there was a mission I just couldn't beat, so you know what? Let me try a different mission instead of smashing my head against the wall multiple times. I'm like, I tried it 3, 4, or 5 times. Yeah, nope. Okay, let's try a different mission. Clear it. Oh, hey, look, there's the Chapter N mission. That happened a couple of times in my Armored Core 4 playthrough, which you can see on my YouTube channel. It's literally, shameless plug there, had to do it. But, that freedom of choice that they used to put in their old games. They implemented that in their Dark Souls formula, and boom, you get Elden Ring. And guess what? It has the widest appeal. Oh yeah, they also added so many different ways you can play. You could do like summons, you could do ranged builds, you could do up close, quick pokey like death by 1,000 cuts type plays, or you can do tanky huge swings of massive damage per swing. So many different ways you can build your character to play. So not only was there freedom of what order you take different sections of the world map, or heck, completing the game without even doing certain content, like in Armored Core, they added that freedom and so much more variety of ways to play, and freedom of choice, where to go, what order to do things in, that it appealed to a wider range of players and became more mainstream than any other From Software game to date. And it won Game of the Year. Now, of course, while we don't give game awards, like the Game Awards, that much credence, because, let's be honest, awards shows tend to be a little out of touch with the actual audience who buys and plays the games. Or, in the case of movie awards shows, they're very out of touch with the people who watch the movies. The vast majority of people who watch the movies. They tend to be kind of, these haughty bigwigs who think they know better than the commoners, And I think the committees on the Game Awards not quite as disconnected from the audience, but still there's a bit of a disconnect. So we're not going to give them so much credit, more credit than it deserves, but still, Elden Ring won Game of the Year above even more mainstream games like God of War Ragnarok and such. And it deserved it, I think. Based on, it's not a game I personally played, but based on what it did, sticking to their guns, From Software did, not forsaking what made their games appeal to their niche audience, but finding something new to do with it that allowed it to kind of break into the mainstream without abandoning what made it unique. They found a great balance, and that's something to be respected. Even if you don't enjoy their types of games, it is something to be respected. And so it absolutely deserved that award. And I really hope that they apply what they learned from that to Armored Core 6. I'm definitely looking forward to that, just because I've always been more of a sci-fi guy over fantasy, and I love mecha. I love robots, so Armored Core 6's announcement's the reason I started diving into the Armored Core series in the first place. But yeah, they found that balance between mainstream and niche, right? They didn't abandon the niche, but they didn't shy away from trying to appeal to a broader audience. And it became a great end product because of it. It's not... Quality and mainstream are not things that are diametrically opposed. They can coexist. They do coexist in a lot of cases. There are other cases where the mainstream trends, are a detriment to the product, but that's because they applied the wrong mainstream things in the wrong ways. There's a lot more nuance to it than just mainstream equals bad. And I honestly don't see that as a respectable notion. And then you look at things like the fighting game genre, right? Which are extremely niche. So niche that they have to make very big changes to the formula in order to appeal beyond the hardcore niche and become something that's actually, profitable on lucrative on a level of almost every other competitive video game genre. And the reason why they fell behind all the other genres so much is because they became too niche, and then the developers focused too hard on designing their games for the hardcore niche and just ignoring the broader audiences, and just rolling with and continuing with the design elements that made them unappealing beyond the niche. That was the wrong way to view their game design, honestly. And I mean, the results show it. The numbers don't lie. You look at another genre that did the same thing, that also was born from the arcades, the shmup or shoot 'em up genre. And that's a genre that was designed for the arcades exclusively. Had its audience, quite popular back in the arcade age. But then after the arcade age, pretty much refused to grow outside of what made them niche. And now the shmup genre is extremely niche, more so than the fighting game genre. Faded into obscurity so much that it's pretty much impossible for any shmup to break out of that niche now. It is like permanently stuck there. That's a case where being niche and sticking to that niche too much for too long practically it didn't kill the genre, but like that genre is pretty much doomed to forever be niche, unless a game, like the only time you ever see shmup mechanics in a mainstream game is when it's a side thing in a bigger game. Like what is it? I've never played Bayonetta either, but I know that it has on rails shooter, which is a variant of the shmup genre, but more akin to games like Star Fox and whatnot. That harkens to an old arcade series called Afterburner. It has little set levels in it that are like that are that gameplay style. you don't get entire games in that gameplay style that break out of the niche, right? It just doesn't happen. It's impossible. Shmup mechanics. They were in Sonic Frontiers, right? The most successful and widely enjoyed Sonic game in the last decade. Well, 3D Sonic game, that is, because Sonic Mania was great because it was just a good 2D Sonic game. But Sonic Frontiers is the first widely, well-received 3D Sonic game in a decade or more. And it had shmup sections in it as a minigame. And spoiler, so just skip like 5 or 10 seconds forward if you don't want a spoiler for Sonic Frontiers at the end. At the very end of it, you have the true final boss, which is a full-on shmup boss battle in the style of Ikariga. Okay, spoiler over. So, yeah, in the case of the shmup genre, the only time it ever exits the niche is when it's a small distraction in a bigger game. Nier Automata has the shmup, portions, the bullet curtain shmup portions as well. When she's like flying with a jetpack or something, some sort of special mecha jetpack, or that's another game I haven't played, but I've seen the gameplay. So it's like one of those things where being too niche for too long is actually just as much of a detriment as mindlessly trying to follow mainstream trends without putting the attention and care to doing it well and making it a good game first and foremost. That's not trying to do things beyond just being a good game. And so there's downsides to both sides of the aisle. There really is. And neither are inherently better. It's about the execution. There are great mainstream games, there are great niche games. There are games that find a great balance between the two, and those are the ones that are like the penultimate games, the peak in the current landscape of gaming. And, this goes beyond just video games, honestly. Just to briefly talk on other elements of entertainment, movies, right? Movies that are mainstream in the wrong ways, trying to cater and be essentially propaganda for mainstream sociopolitical ideals or ideology and messaging, tend to suffer and not be as good products because they focus more on different... They focus less on writing the characters as good characters and try to focus more on what the characters are, not who they are. And often those kind of products, they tend to suffer in the quality department. Tabletop games kind of are doing the same thing now. Heck, recently, and I'm not going to get into discussion about it, but recent knowledge about them stating, and removing, like, what is it, the Dungeons and Dragons company, removing half races from the game because of some notion that mixed races are inherently racist, which I'm like, as a mixed guy myself, the product of a mixed race couple, I find that absurd. If anything, mixed races is the opposite of racism. It's different races getting along and producing a child, right? In this case, me. It's an absurd notion. I'm not going to go deep into that, but like when things like that focus too much on the wrong mainstream things, they suffer for it. The product suffers. But then when you have like these other tabletop game systems that focus on being a good game and facilitating a happy, community that enjoys their product and enjoys playing it together and is welcoming to all sorts of people, they benefit. They have a much more welcoming community, and the product itself is just more enjoyable to more people. And also tends to be just, when the game designer's focus is on making a good and balanced game, it just makes it more fun for people, because then you're not like, the players aren't going to be overpowered to the point where there's no challenge, but then the challenge isn't going to be so tough as nails that it takes focus away from the story, and there's a balance. You have to remember what made it niche, but not let that be shackles. But you also need to not chase the mainstream so much that you forsake what made a thing popular with its niche audience. That middle ground. Let's look at Monster Hunter, actually, to go back to games. The Monster Hunter series. Heavily niche for a long time, from the PlayStation 2 era all the way through the early Switch days with Monster Hunter Generations Ultimate. Very niche because of their game design. Then enter Monster Hunter World, and they figured out what elements that made the game unapproachable to the non-niche audiences, the potential new, broader audiences. They figured out which of those elements to let go of or to change. And then they introduced new elements that improved its, the quality of life changes and improved its game feel for more types of people. And boom, you have Monster Hunter World becoming Capcom's single most successful game of all time. Like their highest seller. And then it just spearheaded the series into more of mainstream than it ever has been, but not to such an extent that it's no longer Monster Hunter. It still is distinctly Monster Hunter. And then Monster Hunter Rise was the result of taking that and then streamlining it a bit more for more of a handheld type of experience on the Switch, which later got ported to PC and the other consoles, but first and foremost on the Nintendo Switch, which is a handheld that's dockable for playing on your TV or monitor. And Monster Hunter Rise ends up being the only game in the series that I actually could enjoy long term. And now it's become my main stream game, to the extent where my Twitch recap said that I put, I've streamed it so much that I was in the top 9% of all streamers who streamed that game. And I've put more than 340 hours into the game and I'm still going. That's a rarity for me with any game. And that's because they took those elements that made it unapproachable outside of the niche, kept the core, and then made the changes where they needed to make it appealing to more people. And boom, now it's one of my favorite games of all time. Like, when I was struggling to enjoy any of the previous Monster Hunter entries that I've attempted to play. Like, there is something to be said for respecting the niche, but finding what elements of the mainstream design to implement. And that's kind of ultimately my conclusion in that topic. If you're too niche and you never try to break free of that, you get the shmup genre, and that's the direction the fighting game genre would have went in if games like Street Fighter 6 didn't start taking into account what was making them unapproachable and figure out how to make a good video game first. And that's what it's shaping up to be. It releases in June, but Street Fighter 6 is looking to be a good video game first, and then a good fighting game second. Remembering the niche, but not being beholden to it to an extent that it becomes shackles. But not chasing the mainstream so much that it's no longer recognizing. And that's pretty much what you need to do. That's the direction Monster Hunter went in. That's the direction a lot of really great games have gone in, like Elden Ring, right? And that's pretty much what it comes down to. I hope they do that with Armored Core 6. I hope to see more games from the niche kind of break out of it by finding just the right amount of mainstream to implement, but not too much to the point where it's no longer what made that game enjoyable. Like the Dissidia series, honestly. Dissidia NT was such a disappointment. That's also a discussion for another day, because I could rant about that for a while, but I'm not going to, because this is long enough. So yeah, if you enjoyed that, then I appreciate if you give a like and subscribe. There will be more discussions, and I will take suggestions on topics. Priority given to Ko-Fi subscribers, and I'll be talking with them directly in my Discord server. But if you enjoyed this, like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you agree with anything I said. If you disagree with anything I said, just keep it clean and keep it civil. I have very strict word filters in place because this is an all-ages space, and it will remain so. So keep it clean, keep it respectful, and I'd love to have a discussion, even if you disagree with anything I said or all of what I said. I'd love to have civil discussions and debates, as long as it's presented in a respectable way, a civil and kind way. And let's talk about it in the comments below, or if you're listening to this in podcast form, then on Twitter with the hashtag counterpick_pod, and then you can at me at s_factor_sam, as you can see in the details of the video, the author section and such. And it'll also be linked to in the show notes in the description. So, and even dislikes on YouTube are helpful, because it gives me an idea of, if I could do something better, or if people disagreed with what I was saying. But it's all engagement that helps me to improve my videos and audios in terms of quality and what content I offer. So give me any feedback that you have. And I even consider the poorly worded ones. Even if those don't become publicly visible, I read them and I take what I can from them in a constructive way. So, but I still would appreciate it if you did so in a pretty mild way. That way I can, have the comments visible to everyone, and we can get some discussions going. So, alright, this has been Sam. I'm going to go on about my day. Hope you have a great rest of your day, or a great night if you're listening to this at the end of a day, and moving on into the next one. I'll see you next week. And hopefully I can do one next week. I'm starting a new job, so I'll do what I can to keep this going as a weekly series, though. Alright, have a good one. I'll see you later.